Hello, good afternoon. Unfortunately, my Lithuanian's a little bit rusty, so I'm going to speak in English with a funny Scottish accent. So I hope you understand. I'll speak slowly, but hopefully clearly. Okay, so my name is Paul Tumelty. I run Mandiant's incident response capability for government clients from Europe to the Middle East to Africa. So we see some interesting things. I'm also the UK and Ireland director for Mandiant, which is now part of Google Cloud. Okay, so this is focused on Ukraine. There's obviously a lot of interest in some of the lessons from Ukraine. Mandiant has been heavily engaged there over the last, since February 2022, the invasion itself. But we have a long-standing history of dealing with the Ukrainian government over the last 20 years since Mandiant's inception. So this is just the background context to what we've done there. So we've mobilized over time around 285 full-time employees, everything from incident response, remediation, intelligence, reverse engineering, project management, etc., etc. We've delivered over 32,000 hours of support to the Ukrainians and provide 24/7 hunt support. And our mission is to detect, investigate, respond, and disrupt predominantly Russian threat actors. This is a brief overview of our investigation processes and methodologies, just so you understand. So essentially, starting from the top down, a victim organization is brought to us by the Ukrainian government. We then coordinate with that victim and provide some cross-engagement synchronization between us, the victim, and the Ukrainian government sponsor. And then we mobilize our incident response team. So that's this main bar in the middle. So essentially, we're deploying a cloud-based endpoint solution into the customer's environment. And in parallel, we're triggering a remediation track so we can immediately try to contain the attacker activity. We also perform that in an iterative cycle across all the different incident response engagements we're supporting. So if we find IOCs of interest, piece of malware, we then go and hunt for that across the entire estate we're supporting. We also perform essentially red teaming against customer environments in order to close down any attack vectors that the attackers might try to exploit. And then once we've got control of the situation, onboard them to our 24/7 hunt and incident response capability. So that's the sort of background then. This is the sort of phases of the war as we see them, based on the extensive visibility we have had into the environment, but also working with other vendors and the Ukrainian government itself. Pretty much 6 phases of the conflict. And I'll talk about each of them in different ways throughout this. This is available online, this graphic. There's various blogs on it. Okay, but the main objective of today is to talk to you about some of the lessons. I've got 15 lessons. There are more lessons than that, but these are the 15 which we deem most significant for other governments, critical infrastructure providers, etc. And the first thing, bearing in mind this is a war zone, is to consider extensive pre-invasion staging by the attackers. So the chart you can see there, if you look at the light blue dots, that's everything before the invasion. So in our case, we've obviously got a partial picture of what's going on. That represents over 60% of the victims we dealt with had an ongoing intrusion before the invasion. Okay? So you can assume significant pre-positioning by the adversary before the conflict, before the kinetic invasion commenced. So our observation there is that you need a systematic program of threat hunting across your entire public sector and into the private sector estate. It's lesson 1. Lesson 2, the cyber domain was, and it remains, highly contested, very dynamic, persistent, and it has complemented the threat actors' kinetic operations. Now, what tends to happen is the news articles will focus on the very visible nature of war, but underneath that, there's been a continuous theme of very dynamic operations by particularly Russian threat actors. So the observation here is you need to be able to scale quickly and bring together rapid cyber defense capabilities to counter that dynamic and opportunistic adversary behavior and targeting in multiple domains of conflict with rapid information sharing across the victim environment. So it was really important that Ukrainians were able to gain as much data as possible, share that really quickly, expose Russian TTPs and IOCs for disruption purposes. One of the other lessons, the third, is that there were challenges with deconfliction of cybersecurity support and third-party funding to victim organizations across the Ukrainian ecosystem. So everybody wanted to help, but sometimes that help wasn't necessarily useful. So our sort of longer-term observation there is to build mechanisms to coordinate and deconflict between four groups, basically, within the host government itself. If anybody works for the Lithuanian government, I'm sure you're aware that there's usually conflicts and tensions between different departments. Between the host government and your CNI sector, so everybody's talked about NIS2, so your CNI is going to grow significantly, as well as the private sector. Thirdly, between the host government and the international community, again, very challenging to try and coordinate and triage all of that support in the middle of a war zone. And fourthly, between the host government and the private sector cybersecurity community. Everybody wants to help, but it's not always useful help. The fourth lesson then is about targeting. So I think everybody questioned, where is the cyber war? Has it happened? Has it taken place? So a lot of those assumptions that you would see energy sector and communications, telecommunications entities being knocked out via cyber means proved largely incorrect, with the exception of the VSAT targeting, which was timed with the invasion. One of the key observations that we've made is that targeting was actually very widespread in nature, and the threat actors targeted entities that aren't traditionally considered high priority or critical infrastructure. So I think as you're thinking about NIS2 and how to protect these entities, it's important to bear in mind that in this case at least, those threat actors went after organizations like media, like IoT systems, PII at a very low local level, down to district level. And essentially what they were doing was collecting information requirements for the long-term occupation of that country. So that's not something that was really in many people's threat models before the war. So I think the lesson for us is, don't mirror image, don't assume the way we think is the way they think. Think about how you protect services that serve the citizen. Like, there was very extensive targeting of communication systems that the Ukrainian government was trying to get information to citizens. The Russian threat actor tried to disrupt that and get in the decision cycle there. And essentially develop an IT and security Marshall Plan to protect all public sector entities, private sector entities that support government services and citizen services. The fifth lesson then is really to know thy enemy, or know thy threat actor. The model that we've sort of reversed across hundreds of investigations we've done here is that this is focused on the military intelligence entities, the GRU threat actors who were in the lead in our assessment for this invasion. Essentially, they followed their own doctrine, right? So it's important that you study your potential adversary in depth. This model they built was designed for speed, scale, and intensity. So every time we disrupted something, blocked something, they very quickly evolved with the next evolution. So this 5-stage model then of living on the edge, so exploiting things like VPNs, routers, living off the land for reconnaissance, lateral movement, etc., going for general policy, disrupt and deny, telegraphing success, is largely overlaid with Russian information doctrine. So stages 1 to 3 focus on reconnaissance. Stage 4 focused on information technical effects, and stage 5 on information psychological effects. Lesson 6 then is that the attackers didn't always necessarily use very advanced techniques, but remained adaptable and often took the path of least resistance. So everybody's fascinated by, what's Turla doing today. That wasn't really necessary in this case. And the other point is that quantity had a quality all of its own. So we've discovered over 50 malware families, some of which are public, some of which aren't. But the key point there is that when you're dealing with such a large volume of activity, you've got to firefight very quickly and mobilize your cyber defenses in a way that you've never done it before. So from a defensive perspective then, again, improving network architecture, modern security tooling, training core personnel and modernizing the IT estate. No different from anything you'll be doing and thinking about in your day jobs, but absolutely key in order to make it more difficult for the attacker. Again, this goes into Russian doctrine, but they blended cyber operations and information operations pretty effectively. The timeline at the bottom shows you, within a couple of hours, essentially, they've exfiltrated data from the victim, they've leaked it to 2 different cyber personas, and blasted that out online, truly or falsely, because they actually weren't successful in this intrusion. So there was a misalignment between different subunits in this GRU operation here. But still, it goes to the point that they are magnifying the impact of an operation. Lesson 8 then is the duplication of effort. So we did find multiple Russian threat actors coexisting in similar customer environments. So the observation here is that there are opportunities from a government perspective to play with that, to exploit it, to disrupt it, using things like deception. And the other point here is that it wasn't just Russian threat actors. So I think when you've got a major geopolitical event, it will attract bad actors from other environments and potentially friendly actors as well. So we did find multiple actors. And that's not unusual with the threat actor's got such a vast ecosystem and multiple sub-teams all reporting to different requirements. 9 then was the adversary's wartime pooling of effort. So we did see that rapid innovation cycle in a way we've not seen it before, very quickly developing new iterations of malware families as we detected and blocked them. They appeared to mobilize additional resources for the invasion. So if you follow Mandiant Intel, it's UNC 2589, which appeared to be a new GRU-specific team. And the other interesting thing we saw was, which we don't think has been seen before, is forward-deployed cyber operations officers in country. So there's a couple of examples of that, where we could see lateral movement from offices that had been captured in eastern Ukraine into the headquarters networks, and they had to be cut off. The other point here is the adversary was also able to sustain parallel cyber espionage operations. So whilst it really did focus most of its efforts on Ukraine and try to contain that to Ukraine, we did see and respond to multiple intrusions in European NATO government agencies, principally for the purpose of tracking diplomatic negotiations and countermeasures. So the lesson there is that the threat actor has to evolve quickly in a case like this, and they do make mistakes, and we picked up on a lot of that as well. As well as, you must maintain vigilance, so everybody focuses on the key problem at hand, but there's other things going on at the same time. Private sector then did play a significant role. Multiple vendors played a key role supporting the Ukrainian government across the full spectrum of cybersecurity capabilities. And our observation there is that, you've got to prepare to embrace this private sector in many cases. That's quite uneven across Europe, I would say. So, I talk to most governments in Europe and the Middle East regularly, and, there is a scale of who's willing to talk to us for whatever reason. But in this case, it was absolutely essential because the Ukrainians were overwhelmed in the early hours of the conflict, and we were able to provide that enabling support very quickly. So within a matter of 1 hour, actually, we'd started supporting our first victim when the Russians rolled across the border. The other thing to bear in mind is some of our top cybersecurity companies do have excellent visibility globally, so you might have a local perspective, but we can put that into a broader context. So the key thing there is public-private partnerships are key to scale up quickly. Cloud solutions were really important here. So in the Ukrainian case, all government IT was on-premise, and then about 2 or 3 days before the war, Zelensky passed an edict to enable them to push backups to cloud providers. So that was absolutely essential from a long-term business continuity perspective. But from my perspective, we would not have been able to support any Ukrainian government victims because our solutions are cloud-based, remotely deployed. That hostile operating environment wouldn't have been possible to put boots on the ground. So that became absolutely critical factor from the Ukrainians' perspective. Okay, so again, thinking about modern cloud solutions, and I know Lithuania is thinking about that, which is great to see. And the 12th lesson then, I've got 5 minutes to go, and this is really the fundamental nature of war and all its horror, is us talking to IT officers on the ground. So incident response, as most of you will know, is a very stressful endeavor at any time. If you're an enterprise organization or a government client, you'll know the pain. But in this case, that was magnified tenfold. So you can see from some of the commentary there, people are operating from bomb shelters. A couple of the clients we were working with were physically destroyed in Russian bombing and missile attacks. And so patience with the client is absolutely key here. And one of the lessons, as a sort of side lesson from this, is obviously this speaks to the country's resilience. So the outstanding heroism of the officers who were working in the middle of a war zone with no electricity, not seeing their families, and their key objective was to get systems back online. So the organizations that were most resilient were experts in disaster recovery. So they were very able to quickly rebuild servers, and even when those servers were wiped again and again, they kept a minimum viable product ongoing. So disaster recovery, obviously that's not just relating to cybersecurity, but that mentality in some of these organizations was absolutely key to success. Nearly there. Centralization, again, if you look across any government in Europe, there'll be a very uneven cyber defense capability in ministries and agencies across the piece. So for us, the observation is that, rather than everybody trying to build their own capability, centralize that capability in crisis times. Ideally you would do it in peacetime as well as wartime. But everybody's got minimal resources, right? So the key thing to do is pull them together. And that worked very well for the Ukrainians because we were able to have single points of contact, and then they would farm us out from the private sector and also mobilize local IT firms. You do need boots on the ground to go and do some of the remediation activities. International cyber capacity building then. So typically some of these programs really focus on things like governance and strategy and training. But during wartime, you kind of got to flip that on your head. You need immediate capability. It needs to be scalable. It needs to be fast. So from our perspective, we needed core technical staff to perform key incident response enabling activities and remediation at scale. So that was absolutely essential for us. And the speed to do that is absolutely essential. So we were able to train the local teams there, take this technology, go and do this, and feed us the results back. Lastly then, many governments obviously want to learn from Ukraine. That's really challenging. You've got to self-assess honestly what your capabilities are. It is really challenging to do this. It's really challenging to understand the threat. Governments don't share with each other. Private sector doesn't really share with each other. So that common understanding of the threat is still quite uneven and a real challenge. But things like understanding your risks, resiliency, and the results of that is really essential. And that's it. Okay. Any questions? Stick us an email.
Mr. Paul, thank you for your presentation.
Sure.
Of course, we have some questions. And Vilnius is asking, Google is available in Russia. Are Mandiant services available there as well?
No. No.
Yes, thank you. Okay, one more. In your opinion, does Russia still have something upon their sleeve in terms of cyber attacks, or was it the best they can do?
I think they probably do still have something up their sleeve, which is the point I made earlier. Like, the hierarchy of organizations there, it was clearly the military intelligence threat actors in the lead, followed by the FSB, and then thirdly, the SVR. So I think, they still have the ability to scale up. And there's the other thing about the relationship between the cyber criminal ecosystem and the Russian state, which is also quite interesting. So that's a threat that hasn't quite manifested itself, but could in the future.
Okay, thank you very much,
All
Paul.
right.
Unfortunately, we don't have enough time for the questions.